Thank you. Hello and good evening, everyone. My name is Colin Smith. I'm a Policy and Economy Advisor at the North Tyne Combined Authority, and I tend to lead on the housing and land matters for the Combined Authority. I've been asked by the facilitators to talk a little bit about home ownership in the North of Tyne. So simply put, in our area, housing stock or units that you might hear people say is basically the number of homes. So these fall into three broad categories. So we've got local authority housing, which you might often hear referred to as council housing. That's housing that is owned by the local authority and let to people on rents that are usually below market average. We've got private registered providers, more commonly referred to as social housing, who are typically not-for-profit organisations who let homes to a range of people on a variety of rents that are usually below market average. And then we've got private sector housing, which includes people who own their own home and live in it, as well as people who own a home that they may rent out to private tenants at a market rent. So I'll just do a little bit of a quick deep dive into each of those categories. So for local authorities, the main providers in the North of Tyne are Newcastle City Council. Their housing function and operations are delivered through an arm's length management organisation, which you might hear referred to as an ALMO. And that's called Your Homes Newcastle. Your Homes Newcastle have around 25,000 properties in the Newcastle City Council area. North Tyneside Council have about 14,900 properties in their council area, and Northumberland County Council have about 8,500 properties in their area. So a little bit on private registered providers. There are a number of private registered providers active in the North of Tyne. These are organisations that own and manage social housing, but they are distinct organisations that are separate from the local authorities, although they do have a very close working relationship with local authorities. The five biggest registered providers in the North of Tyne, it's probably worth saying that some of them have different geographies. So some are national organisations that have a regional presence. Some are organisations that have a very strong footprint in the region. So the top five, I would say, that are active in our area are Home Group, which are a national organisation. They have around 49,000 properties. We've got Carbon, who are based mostly in the Northeast, Tees Valley and Yorkshire. And they've got about 26,500 properties, again, with quite a majority of those in the Northeast. We've got Bernicia Group with around 13,500 properties. They have quite a solid footprint in the Northeast, particularly in Northumberland. And then there's two larger national providers called Places for People and Riverside. Again, national organisations, but with strong presence in the North of Tyne. It is really important to note that there are a number of smaller providers, registered private providers that provide properties and homes throughout the area. And again, those big national operations with a regional presence. On the private sector, there are two main forms of ownership, which we refer to as owner-occupied or private rented sector. So owner-occupied simply means that the owner occupies the property and lives there. The private sector means that the owner lets the property to tenants, usually at a competitive market rent for the type of property that's being let. So obviously, if you're renting a 4-bedroomed house, it's going to cost more than a 1-bed. So according to our data, there are around 300,000 private sector households in the North of Tyne. And the Office for National Statistics, or the ONS as they're sometimes referred to, estimate that in the North of Tyne, there are about 50,000 people living in the private rented sector. And that leaves around 254,000 owner-occupied properties in the North of Tyne. So putting that aside, I've also been asked to talk about the age of housing stock in the North of Tyne. Great, I'll try and speak quickly. So again, for this energy performance certificates data, so you might hear this referred to as EPC data, that shows how energy efficient a home is. And we have data at the North of Tyne level for around 80% of properties in the area. EPC data is grouped between A and G, with A being very efficient and G being very inefficient. And EPC of C is considered a good benchmark of good practice. So the EPC data for the North of Tyne, unfortunately, broadly shows that around 70% of private sector properties, and that's those that are both owner-occupied and privately rented, have an EPC D or below. So that's, you know, a huge majority of properties that aren't quite at that EPC benchmark. So obviously this is below that benchmark. This is likely to do with the age of housing stock in the north of Tyne. So in line with national trends, the housing stock in the north of Tyne is old, with over 50% of the housing stock across all 10 years having been built before 1965. Within that, there are concentrations of private sector housing, which we estimate to be around a third, that were built pre-1919. So we've got a rapidly aging and increasingly aging stock as well. Because of their age, these properties are often colder, uninsulated or minimally insulated, and poorly ventilated, which makes them harder and more expensive to heat, which goes some way to explaining why that EPC data shows that our housing stock is very energy inefficient. Understandably, and again, as a result of post-war council house building, a greater majority of council and social housing properties that were built post-1945, these properties have also benefited from previous government initiatives called the Decent Homes Standard, which brought a large number of council and social housing properties up to modern standards. And that included things like they be in a reasonable state of repair, that they have reasonably modern facilities and services, and provide a reasonable degree of thermal comfort as well. I was asked to speak for 5 minutes, and I'm probably nearing my time now. But I'm looking forward to meeting you all in the breakout sessions, and I'll happily answer any questions that you might have.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Callum. Okay, we're going to go on to our next commentator now, who is Professor Simin Devoudi. Okay, Simin, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Pete, for that. And hello and good evening to everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here and be asked to make a modest contribution to this debate. As members of the Assembly have identified, housing plays a key role in our health and well-being, as well as addressing climate change. 34% of the emissions in the combined authority area come from heating, hot water and electricity use in residential buildings. This figure is, by the way, much higher than the national average of 20%. Making our homes energy efficient reduces our energy bill, addresses the growing problem of fuel poverty, and shrinks our carbon footprint. To make our homes fit for the future, we need to both retrofit the existing stock that Callum was just talking about, very old existing stock sometimes, and build all new homes with higher energy efficiency standards. For that to happen, everyone has a role to play, and that includes central and local governments, financial institutions, developers, construction industry, and householders, all working in a coordinated way together. The progress made so far is not enough for meeting the UK's ambitious net zero target for 2050. We are lagging behind because of a series of shortcomings in the regulatory and incentivization measures. In terms of retrofitting, the uptake of measures such as loft and cavity wall insulations hasn't been great. In fact, it dropped considerably after government cancelled its zero carbon home policy, which left many businesses stranded. Housing tenure that Callum was talking about is another major factor. Private landlords have little incentives to invest in energy efficiency because the benefit of reduced energy bill goes to the tenants rather than to themselves. So existing regulations prioritize capital cost for landlords over running costs for tenants. Social landlords, including councils, again, Callum mentioned who they are very well placed to improve their stock, but evidence suggests that many don't have long-term strategy to do so. The uptake of energy efficiency measures by owner-occupiers, people who own their own house, has also been rather low because of a number of issues: affordability, limited advice, lack of trust in the retrofitting companies, and potential disruptions to their daily lives. In terms of the new build, there are standards in place already, but firstly, they are not adequate for achieving low carbon housing. Secondly, the industry doesn't always comply with them. And thirdly, they are sometimes being interpreted differently by different local authorities. There are gaps in building regulations and there are loopholes in the planning system, both of which need to be tightened up, and the existing rules need to be better enforced. For that to happen, building regulation bodies and local planning authorities, they need adequate resources, which obviously is now hard to come by given the massive cuts to their budgets. In addition, planning authorities in our region face another challenge, which is related to the housing market. House prices are much lower here in our region than in the south. This reduces planning authorities' bargaining power to insist on compliance with higher standards, because if they do, developer would complain about the viability of their development. Like most of the country, we are facing a shortage of affordable housing. And as long as we are dependent on private developers to build new homes, we will find it very difficult to deliver houses that are fit for the future.
I have a minute left.
Okay, unless the public sector steps in to enforce tougher measures and also to bridge the potential viability gap, I think we are unlikely to achieve our ambition for affordable, low carbon and high quality homes. Just finally, one government department, which is responsible for agriculture and environment, has declared that public money should pay for public good. I think this principle should be applied to housing as well, because homes that are built to high environmental standards play a significant role in improving public health and achieving long-term safety and sustainability.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Simin. I particularly like all your books that you have behind you. Or maybe it's wallpaper. Is it wallpaper? Okay, great. Thank you very much. So our next commentator is Matt Copeland. He's from National Energy Action. Go ahead, Matt.
Hi everyone. Thanks, Pete. Brilliant to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak to you. So, as Pete says, I'm Matt Copeland. I am the policy manager at National Energy Action. National Energy Action is the national fuel poverty charity, and we're one of the national charities that are based in Newcastle. So what I'm going to talk to you about is what's happening at a national level to address energy efficiency in homes and fuel poverty. And I'll explain what fuel poverty is in a little bit, and give you some thoughts on how we might prioritise action, and I'll finish up on some potential local actions that might achieve this. So we've already heard about what the emissions are like from buildings in the northeast, and Callum's already mentioned EPCs. I think one of the statistics that is useful to remember is that quite easily most homes in our region are rated worse than EPCC. So in terms of decarbonising homes, I think it's really worth thinking about what the aims are at a national level before we consider what happens at a local level. The aim in England is for all properties to reach EPC Band C by 2035. So that's 60% of all homes, I think, across the nation. I think it was more than that in our region, needing to be upgraded to meet that target. It's worth bearing in mind that that won't get us all the way to our net zero ambitions, but I think the Committee on Climate Change, so the experts say that that's consistent with what we do need to do in order to reach our end goals. There's a really important question, and that's, in doing that, who do we prioritise? who gets to go first in terms of improving the efficiency of our homes. We as a charity obviously believe that fuel poor households should be prioritised, and that's actually something that's part of UK law. So fuel poverty has a legal definition. A person is regarded as living in fuel poverty if they are a member of a household living on lower income in a home which cannot be kept warm at a reasonable cost. Essentially what that means is a household that cannot afford to keep warm. And something to note that's been touched on a minute ago is that fuel poverty and energy efficiency in general isn't just an energy or housing issue, it's a health one too. Being cold impacts your health, it makes certain illnesses like respiratory conditions much worse, and householders can develop new illnesses if they live in cold homes. The government measures whether a home is in fuel poverty by combining a couple of things. If it has an EPC of worse than C, so D, E, F or G, and the home has a lower income, which is 60% or less than 60% of the median income, then they're measured as being fuel poor. And the reason I'm talking about fuel poverty specifically is that the only energy efficiency target for England is the fuel poverty target. The only legal target is the fuel poverty target, and that is for all fuel poor homes to reach EPC C by 2030 as a legal obligation for the government. So that's 5 years before the rest of the population. So given the urgency of that and how close we are, that's where I'm going to focus the rest of my talk. The scale of the issue is quite big. So 3 million households nationally live in fuel poverty by the government's own statistics. And in our region, there's more than 34,000 fuel poor homes that need to be upgraded to EPCC by 2030. So what do we do about it? So the government does have a national plan. I agree with what's been said before, that it's not, doesn't contain everything that would need to be done, but there are things that are being done. And I'll split it into those different tenures. So for owner-occupiers, there is an energy company obligation, where energy suppliers give grants to upgrade homes, and that's funded through our energy bills. There's also funding provided to local authorities from central government in order to upgrade fuel-poor homes. So there is funding already allocated to the issue of upgrading owner-occupier fuel-poor homes. For private renters and social renters, as has already been sort of explored, there are minimum standards. Currently, for private renters, the minimum standard only gets you to EPCE, so not a very good rating. But the government is thinking about how they get to EPCC, how they have that as a minimum standard for private renters. And for social renters, we've already heard about the decent home standard, and that will be updated soon. The government says in order to be consistent with that EPCC target. And there's also funding for social landlords to help them get there as well. So overall, there is a landscape in order to get there. Thank you. So given that there is this national landscape, what do we think needs to happen at the local level? So I've identified three things and one overarching thing. Firstly, to ensure that local authorities properly ensure minimum standards in the private rented sector, we think that the region could provide coordination support or even direct funding in order to provide the people resource in order to properly enforce those standards. We think there should be a real coordinated effort to attract the funding from energy suppliers and government to help alleviate fuel poverty in the North East, given that it's available. And we think that there should be clear link-ups between the fuel poverty, gender and health agencies, so that work to improve buildings also helps to improve people's health. And we think that all of this can be wrapped up in the local fuel poverty plan. I really hope that that's been useful for all of you, and I'm really looking forward to, like everyone else, the breakout groups and taking some more of your questions.
Okay, the final commentator for this evening is Professor Helen Jarvis. Helen, are you with us? I can't see you. There you are. Wonderful. Nice backdrop.
Thank you. Yes. Well, as you've already seen and heard from some of the UK statistics that was shared, half of greenhouse gas emissions are come from transport and residential sectors combined, and the other half, or at least a significant proportion, is food waste management and consumer stuff that also have a damaging impact. And the common denominator here is housing related behaviour, how and where we live and what we can realistically do to reduce our carbon footprint. So the point I wish to make, which is a little bit different from the previous speakers, it's kind of a more holistic approach, is that the role of housing in our climate emergency and how we can make our new and existing housing stock better is more than material. It's not enough to re-engineer the physical envelope of individual homes. And as Simin has already said, new housing represents a tiny fraction of existing housing stock. So when we consider affordability and sustainability as twin sides of the same coin, we must look for neighbourhood scale interventions that align social justice with ecological justice. So this is, again, reminds us that increasing the supply of conventional housing that's available in the pipeline will not bring down prices, and it's definitely not going to change behaviour. That's not to say that what I'm going to talk about in just a moment is one or the only solution. It's a niche solution, but it teaches us a little bit about the integrated, joined up thinking needed, I think. So I'm going to argue that we must invest in people-powered social architectures of community housing in tandem with new and retrofitted material interventions. So this sort of represents a shift from top-down or self-help kind of thinking to a scale and process of do it together. There's a problem in conventional housing supply, whatever the tenure, is that self-containment, often of one person living alone, actively drives overconsumption. People buy more stuff and there's little chance to share and bond with neighbours. And one solution, and I'm really reducing the argument here because of shortness of time, but it's to promote more collective and more cooperative living arrangements. This doesn't mean all living under one roof, and it's not as radical as it sounds. It's about looking at what can be jointly owned and managed at a neighbourhood scale to promote one planet living. So community housing schemes, and there are examples, you know, in Leeds, Sheffield, Cambridge, Brighton and elsewhere. There aren't any currently in North Tyneside, but in a moment, if I have time, I can show you a vision of what is to propose to be the first pioneering co-housing on Tyneside. And in fact, the illustration behind me is sort of from that scheme. But first of all, I just want to elaborate on two of what I call economies of sharing that are at work at this scale. Firstly, designing and managing shared resources jointly, residents together, helps to create landscapes that provide opportunities for growing food, habitats for wildlife. They reduce running costs and they improve the affordability of homes. Secondly, it's this scale, this kind of meso scale, at which pro-environmental behaviour is cultivated and influenced, for instance, by neighbours who are able to pick up and practice green habits, learning from each other. Individuals are not left struggling to do the best for the planet on their own. It's also true that many architects say that when you have high-tech, very energy efficient homes, how effective those are is all down to the occupants. Occupants have to know how to use those technologies, and they have to have some sense of empowerment over those uses. So there has been research that's has been done to quantify the gains of community housing from combining, as I say, very energy efficient homes, which can be retrofitted or new built, with social architectures of pro-environmental behaviour. And these quantifications show consistently lower ecological footprints than mainstream comparisons. For example, very much higher rates of recycling and composting that can produce up to 75% less waste packaging, you know, the usual waste disposal by the local authority. And the communal focus encourages car sharing schemes and allows community co-working spaces, and it reduces other forms of sort of waste and consumption. I was asked to make some recommendations, and I'll be very brief with this. There's a key role for local authorities and indeed by the combined authority in championing community-led housing at a strategic planning level, and then weighing up the social and ecological gains, for example, against what are often very technical considerations of best value or best consideration when or deciding where assets are transferred, like public land or public buildings, which might be retro. Okay, right. Another recommendation would be to incentivise registered social landlords, housing associations, for instance, to develop social rented co-housing or community housing. So much more empowerment of people-powered co-housing. And also to make it possible to reduce the level of parking standards through measures in the travel plan to encourage walking, cycling and the use of public transport. Heidelberg's a good example of this, where community housing is incentivised because it enables car-free developments where car parking is just limited to disabled parking and carpooled e-vehicles. I've had some other recommendations, but I'll leave those. Have I got 30 seconds to just show a couple of visuals?
Go for it. You're literally 30 seconds. Go ahead, Helen.
Okay. Right, I'll just whisk through. Oops. So, you know, just to illustrate that this is a joined up issue about neighbourhood scale. Retrofit can be ordinary street houses where this one in Sheffield, an atrium at the back of a terraced housing has combined 4 terraced houses, created passive house energy efficiency, created shared gardens for growing spaces, and the households can organise all those areas cooperatively. And then the scheme that I'm sitting in front of, which you know, it's hopefully not. We've got a website to show residents and neighbourhood benefits from a passive house scheme of co-housing 25 units. Just some illustrations of how this has been achieved in other parts of northern cities like Leeds and anyone who's interested in the kind of social architectures behind this can have a look at the website for that. Okay, I had to really race along that. I can talk about the other recommendations in the group.